LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Israeli Prime Minister says he's instructed his military to keep fighting in Lebanon despite growing international calls for a ceasefire. The Israeli Defense Forces say they're carrying out precise strikes in Beirut and claim the head of a Hezbollah Air Force unit has been killed. James Marlowe, a journalist and security analyst, told LBC the Israelis have been left with no choice.
If you don't do that, the residents simply won't come back. They're too scared to come back. The president of Israel, just a couple of days ago, also saw the intelligence that before Israel hit in the last week, that they were planning a similar attack to what Hamas did on October the 7th.
The Metropolitan Police is looking at whether anyone else could be pursued for criminal offences in relation to the allegations against Mohammed Al-Fayed. The force is investigating historic claims of sexual assault and rape by at least 37 women. The Met also says they've been contacted by a number of new potential victims. Detectives have arrested two more people over the murder of 15-year-old Dejon Campbell in south-east London. An 18-year-old was arrested last night on suspicion of murder and remains in police custody. A 15-year-old boy was arrested on suspicion of perverting the course of justice. 7 current and former Met police officers are to face a gross misconduct hearing next month in connection with the murder of Sarah Everard. The 33-year-old was raped and murdered in 2021. Charlotte Lynch reports for LBC.
5 serving and 2 former officers are accused of accessing documents about the Sarah Everard case, despite having nothing to do with the investigation. It was one of the most high-profile cases in the Met's history, with one of the force's own serving PCs, Wayne Couzens, found guilty of killing her. The officers are accused of breaching confidentiality after the force looked into who had accessed documents and when.
And there's a warning of significant flooding in central England tonight and tomorrow. There's an amber warning for rain coming in force. Some areas could see 60 millimetres of rainfall in a matter of hours. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 12 points at 82.81. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.20. LBC weather turning very wet this evening for most of England and Wales. A few showers in Northern Ireland and Scotland with a low of 3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. One of the things I'm really proud about our programme is that we have kept Ukraine in the spotlight over the last, really ever since the 22nd of February 2022. But ever since the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year, Ukraine has gone down the media agenda to an alarming degree, I think. So we, on this programme, like to keep it relatively near the top of the agenda, because I've always thought that if the Ukrainians lose this fight, and that there will be severe consequences for the world for that, because we all know when any dictator wins, there are consequences, and they don't stop. One of the lessons I've learned from editing my book on dictators, available in all good bookshops and bad ones, one of the things I've learned from that is if you don't stand up to a dictator, they will just carry on accruing power, accruing extra territory until at some point they're stopped. You only have to go back not very far in history to learn that that is almost always the case. And democracies, I think, have become flabby and weak and don't really understand why it is that democracies should always stand up to dictatorships. Now, I've been pleasantly surprised at the Western reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't think Putin thought that the West would be as united as it has been. I think after 2 years, he assumed that we wouldn't be still staunch in our support for Ukraine, but we are. So is the United States, so is France, so is Germany, so is more or less the entire European Union. Certainly, I think you could say that NATO has been more united than possibly people ever thought it could be over something like this. But there is a crunch point about to come, and it is should Britain, should the US give permission for long-range missiles, which we've supplied to Ukraine, to be used to be fired into Russia itself. Now, whatever side you're on in this dispute, and I'm hoping most of you are on the side of Ukraine, but whichever side you're on, that is a major decision for the British government, for the American government to make. And that's what we're going to partly talk about in this hour. But we're also going to talk about Donald Trump because J.D. Vance, his vice presidential candidate, has come up with, I think, an absolutely madcap idea that the way to end this war is for Ukraine effectively to say to Russia that they can keep all the territory that they've conquered, thereby rewarding a dictator. Now, I don't think that's a good idea. Now, it may be that the end of this will result in some compromise, but it's not for the US to dictate the terms of that. It's not for Britain to dictate the terms of that. It is for the Ukrainians to decide if they ever wish to concede any territory. I hope they don't. I hope they don't ever do that. I hope they can repel the Russian forces for as long as it takes. But Donald Trump has lashed out at Zelenskyy this week for not making any concessions to Russia. And he's effectively said that he would stop backing the Ukrainians if he won the presidential election in November. Now, to me, that means that, I mean, he's almost forfeited his right to win the election just with that one single comment. Let's just hear what he said.
Those buildings are down. Those cities are gone. They're gone. And we continue to give billions of dollars to a man who refuses to make a deal, Zelenskyy. There was no deal that he could have made that wouldn't have been better than the situation you have right now. You have a country that has been obliterated, not possible to be rebuilt. It'll take hundreds of years to rebuild it. There's not enough money to rebuild it if the whole world got together.
Well, I'd love to hear what you think of Donald Trump's remarks there. I mean, there may be one or two of you that hate Trump but think, well, actually, he's got a point. I don't think he has a point at all. Now, we have two guests with us for this hour. They're going to be taking your calls in a moment, but let's talk to them first. We have Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall with us, former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, and he's author of the new book, The House of War, The Struggle Between Christendom and the Caliphate. Welcome to you, Sir Simon.
Thank you very much, Ian.
By the way, I've always wanted to ask, and I've never understood this, why is the word lieutenant pronounced lieutenant in Britain and lieutenant in America? Is it
well, I think
an American?
it's because it was lieutenant in France, and as usual, we don't wish to be following our French friends. The Americans were, of course, helped by the French during the American Revolution, and they adopted the French term, lieutenant rather than lieutenant.
Thank you for that. Peter Dickinson joins us live from Kyiv. He's editor of the Atlantic Council's UkraineAlert blog. Peter, very good to speak to you again. Just tell us a little bit about your blog. It does what it says on the tin, I guess.
Yeah, essentially. Good evening. Yes, essentially. It's we publish around 5 or 6 articles a week from different experts, international commentators, and a lot of Ukrainian authors as well. Members of the civil society, academics, and also the political classes here. So we try to give an inside view of what's going on in Ukraine from the expert community and the Ukrainian community.
How much of a talking point is it, Peter, about what's likely to happen in the American election in November? Because it's become crystal clear. If there was any doubt about Donald Trump's view of the war in Ukraine, we now know exactly what he thinks. Now, that must be very worrying for people on the streets of Kyiv.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a quite a high degree of wishful thinking. I think up until this last few days, a lot of people would say, "Oh well, it's just election rhetoric. It's just Trump being Trump. He likes to say these things." And then, over the course of the campaign, every time he picks a new person to be close to him within his team, they're almost always pretty outspoken, sort of pro-Kremlin, anti-Ukrainian figures. So it was adding up. But then, of course, these comments that you've just played on the show there a few minutes ago, in the last day or two, have really, been the last nail in the coffin. Really, it's pretty much clear. Like there's really, if he becomes president, Ukraine's outlook is pretty desperate. I mean, we don't know exactly what it will look like, but it won't look good.
And the sad thing is, it might prove to be a vote winner in the US because, I mean, traditionally, there's been a big part of the US electorate that is quite isolationist. And there'll be a lot of people who think we've been spending billions of dollars of American tax dollars on a foreign war, which has nothing to do with us. Let's spend it on Americans. And there is a superficial attraction to that argument, isn't there? That's the problem.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people underestimate how isolationist America is traditionally. I mean, America has a long tradition of isolationism, and especially after Iraq and Afghanistan, the appetite for getting involved in foreign adventures and spending a lot of money on foreign wars is very, very low. So, yeah, I would sort of counter by saying that most of the polls still indicate that the majority of Americans do support backing Ukraine. They do support the American position, the American support for Ukraine, and they do recognise that it's in America's interest. But if we look at the Republican Party, then it's much more evenly split, and Trump, of course, dominates. So his voice is his vote is the casting vote.
Simon, do you think that this is something where Trump says one thing leading up to the election, and then after the election he takes another stance because he's so unpredictable in his foreign policy, which is in some ways a strength for him?
Yes, it is. It's a worry, as the interview would say. This is set in such hard terms today. But the reality is, it is the sort of language we heard in the 1930s from certain elements of the American party, or certainly call it 1940, when London was being bombed, and to an extent there was a deal on the table from Hitler, who had overrun everywhere fundamentally. And you could see the attraction. London's been damaged, London being wrecked, the British people are this, the young people are being killed, etc. There's nothing worth this. But it's a huge, tragic abrogation of American leadership responsibility. We're all of an age that grew up with our security and our prosperity underpinned by American leadership. And one appreciates the American taxpayers' dollars. I was in Germany when I was a young soldier, officer, and undoubtedly the Americans were there. And without the Americans, we would not have held the line on the inner German border. And we had to do it for year after year after year, and the consequences would have been desperate. NATO has been NATO as an institution, including, of course, the Americans, has been remarkably resilient in this. And, of course, Sweden and Finland, who know exactly the consequences of Russia being allowed to get away with aggression in Ukraine, signed up as, traditionally neutral countries to join NATO. So it does worry me that with that sort of throwing Zelenskyy under the bus or Ukraine under the bus, America really will abrogate its moral, responsibility to Milo, or its just moral right to lead the inverted commas the free world. But
because in some ways this
worrying talk
it is very worrying. But I was going to say, it sort of dropped down the agenda in terms of the presidential election. And I wonder, and I think this is going to be the same with Israel and Gaza, where Kamala Harris probably won't want to engage on this, because I'm not sure that either of these things is going to be a vote winner for her. So therefore, we're at a sort of period of stasis, aren't we? Because if the Americans effectively opt out of both of these wars for the next couple of months, that is going to could have some quite serious consequences.
It will. And look, China is watching. Tehran is watching. Certainly the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah will be watching. And so much depends, and I say this, as a very proud patriotic Brit, but a huge transatlanticist, very much depends on firm leadership and firm messaging from Washington. And you're absolutely right. If Trump does win, and there are elements that I would be a natural small c conservative Republican supporter, we'll have a huge hiatus anyway. This is always the problem when you get a change of president. That suddenly 10,000 civil servants and people we know in the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, the State Department, all move. So it's a very bad time to be going into an election, let alone with the individuals who are going to fight it out on November the 5th. I think it's the 5th.
Right, an anonymous WhatsApp message here says, both of your guests are pro-Ukraine and biased against Russia. Maybe you should get someone who is objective. So I would laugh at texts like this because, I mean, obviously Peter is in Ukraine, which makes me think that, yes, he would be probably biased in favour of Ukraine because he lives there and runs a blog called UkraineAlert. It just baffles me how people think that there is even a Russian side to this, given the fact that they've invaded a sovereign country.
Well, Putin, part of that, as I say, because you very kindly mentioned my book, is about how people build narratives of historical entitlement, historical inspiration, and historical grievance. And Putin has done a very effective job, certainly with the European Russians, of building up an idea that this is, yet another episode in history of the West trying to keep Russia away from its natural destiny to be a great power. And I can see why that is seductive. But this is the 21st century. A great power like Russia, that's a member of the United Nations Security Council, permanent member, should not be trying to come up with any excuse for invading a sovereign neighbouring country. It's a shocker. And of course, we were all expecting, Ian, and you would have been reporting on it, as Putin was, that this would be 2 weeks, Zelenskyy dead or gone, puppet government in Kiev, Donbass annexed, all the resources of Ukraine now flowing into the coffers, fait accompli to the West and to NATO, and Moscow and Russia and Moscow and China and Tehran, patting themselves on the back. It has not gone according to plan. And Russia is the deeply weakened state, but it's doubling down on its aggression.
It's very rare that I plug a BBC programme on this programme, but I will do because they've done this on BBC Two in recent weeks. They've had this brilliant 3-part series, a sort of biographical documentary about Zelenskyy. And I learned such a lot about that, not just about the history of Ukraine, but there was things I didn't know about him. Highly recommend it. If you have a chance, watch it on iPlayer. It's absolutely brilliant television. The BBC should do more things like that. Right, we'll come to your calls in a moment, and we'll hear more from our 2 guests, Peter Dickinson and Sir Simon Mayall. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Iain Dale. Text 84850. This is LBC.
19 minutes past 8. Tom says, the Ukraine invasion must stop as it causes immense civilian suffering and a humanitarian crisis. Continued financing from the UK risks escalating the conflict and drawing in more nations. Sorry, I must have misunderstood you there. I thought you said the Ukrainian invasion must stop. We're not invading Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine. He continues, we should invest in diplomacy instead of military support, focusing on sustainable solutions and addressing pressing domestic issues like healthcare and education. Trump is right, says Tom. Simon, this is what people are up against, isn't it? People like Tom, who basically want to have a group hug and think, well, everything can be solved by diplomacy. I mean, if only it were true.
I know. This is always the problem. This is why we talk sometimes about smart power. That we love soft power, it's great. It's how business should be done. Reasonable people coming to reasonable solutions so they'll win-win. But the reality is some people throw that rule book out the window. And the House of Lords has just published a Defence Committee report talking about how actually Britain has squandered what I call the holiday from history since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and left our armed forces and the resilience of the nation. And you could say the same about the French and the Germans and any number of European countries, because we're not prepared to face the world as it is, sadly, where people do not envy us, or perhaps they're envious, but they don't admire us for our prosperity, for our democracy, for our freedoms, and are quite prepared to take us on. And this is the nature of the world we live in at the moment. Some major challenges, and nothing in history gives us the God-given right to the lifestyle we have here, unless you're prepared as a nation or a society or community of nations to be prepared to stand up and defend it against challenges. It's the story of history.
Peter Dickinson in Kyiv, how do you respond to someone like Tom, who seems to think it's kind of all the fault of the West that this is happening? I mean, I'm slightly putting words into his mouth, but there'll be lots of people listening to this who do think that and automatically take the side of the aggressor here.
Well, I mean, I think there is a sort of assumption on some parts to say, well, can't we all just work this out? Can't we have a compromise? Can't we sort of have you said, a group hug? I think that, it comes from, it's rooted in a very deep misunderstanding or failure to understand what Putin is, what Russia represents, what they're all about. Well, this has been going on for a long time. Putin, ever since he became president, like almost 25 years ago, has been on very much a sort of revanchist, revisionist track. One of the first things Putin did when he came to power was bring the Soviet national anthem back. Then he crushed the press, he crushed Chechnya, of course, and then he turned his attention to the former Russian Empire around him, Georgia first, then Ukraine. And he's very open when he talks about this domestically in terms of the fact that this is an imperial conquest, that he wants to right the wrongs of the Soviet collapse and return the Russian Empire. He talks about Ukrainian land as historically Russian land. He openly says that this is theirs, that Ukraine has no right to exist. Now, there's a lot more Russian land in Putin's definition than Ukraine. It stretches, Finland was part of the Russian Empire, Poland was part of the Russian Empire, the Baltic states, Moldova, all of Central Asia, and then, of course, you've got the Soviet territory. So the idea that he would just simply agree to some compromise and stop, especially if he was given a victory in Ukraine, is pretty much pie in the sky. I mean, he's going to go further unless he's stopped. He's going to keep pushing it. And the idea that we can sort of buy him off, I mean, essentially it's just appeasement. I mean, it's 1930s again, all over again, the same sort of, well-meaning philosophy that just simply does not register with these sort of dictators like Putin.
Let's go to Andy in Southend. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Ian. How are you? I'm
all right, thank you. What would you like to say?
I'd wonder, particularly listening to your last speaker, I'd like them to just draw a line and end it. Admit Ukraine to the EU, admit Ukraine to NATO, and then dare Putin to attack what is left. If Ukraine's a member of NATO, just, dare him. And my reasons for thinking that,
that can never be part of the United Kingdom's defence policy to dare another country to attack. I mean, that's lunatic, isn't it, Simon?
Well, the danger, of course, is you'd need 27, 28, 30 now nations to all agree to extend an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine in the middle of a war. And I understand the sentiment behind your statement. But the idea that people are going to, and I know it's going to be part of the Zelenskyy peace plan, which is yet to be unrolled. But the difficulty of doing this, even if you thought it was a good idea, was to get 30 nations to sign up to giving a security guarantee. And when you say dare it, and then turn into your public and say Putin has dared it, we're now collectively at war with Russia. And unfortunately, I fear we're going to have to fight this one out. But we're doing it at a bad time. We've got huge debts across Europe. We've spent all our money on welfare and migration, and we've spent it on healthcare, etc. We've run down our armed forces, and we don't have governments prepared to be honest with their publics, because the consequences of honesty are a real reallocation of resources, which is politically very unfortunate. And of course, for the most part, it is the Americans carrying the burden of this, even though I think Britain has played a very honourable role since the initial Russian invasion. But it is very difficult to say, because NATO is a bunch of sovereign nations, so is the EU. We give these guarantees, attractive as they are. Maybe they'll come in the long term.
Peter Dickinson in Kiev, would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, I think the caller touches on a key issue here, which is the idea that the war will not be cannot really be considered over, even if fighting were to stop, if we had a pause or a ceasefire, unless Ukraine has some sort of very, very credible security guarantees. This is something you hear a lot in Kiev. It's something that people are very conscious of, and the only thing, the only concrete proposal is always NATO membership. But again, there is a recognition. I think that's a tall order, and it's not going to happen quickly. So, really, what I think what people have to start discussing more seriously, certainly Zelenskyy and other Western leaders, is the idea of concrete sort of bilateral security deals, the kind of thing that South Korea has, for example, that Japan has with America, those sort of agreements that could somehow be a stopgap towards maybe NATO membership, because that's going to be a very tough call. Frankly, I don't even know if it's realistic. But the core idea that without some sort of security in place, long-term, credible security that's going to convince the Russians, it's just going to happen again in a few years, even if there's a pause, because Russia's very clear on what it wants to achieve, and it's only going to stop if it has the sort of NATO level security guarantees that are going to block them.
Yeah, but as Peter's absolutely right, the red lines are there to ensure they're not crossed, and Putin's laid out a number of red lines, and of course they have been breached. The Iranians lay out red lines, and the worry is always you lay out red lines, but if you're not prepared to step up and take the consequences of those. And I remember with Barack Obama and the red lines over the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And you know that, Ian.
And that's partly the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, isn't it? Because we...
Where's your credibility?
We in the West did not react to that. We allowed him to take Crimea with barely a whimper. We allowed him to go into Georgia with barely a whimper. And so he assumed that the West was so weak that we wouldn't respond to the invasion
and we
of
came
Ukraine.
out of Afghanistan precipitously to serve domestic agenda.
Right, let's go to James, who's a new caller in Jersey. Hello, James.
Hey, and hey, guys. Just a bit of context from my perspective. So, I guess with many people, I've been watching the outcomes of the war for the last couple of years, or at least as it existed for the last couple of years. Initially, I think, like yourself, Ian, really booned by what was a really strong Western response to Russia's initial invasion or full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But gradually got more and more sort of depressed, seeing our kind of ever-weakening response to everything that Russia seems to escalate with. So I guess broad question is, what do you guys think happens next? Ultimately, my view is we look pretty weak. We've done enough to stop Ukraine from dying, but we seemingly are willing to watch her bleed to death. We are seeming terrified of Russian escalation. Biden is, asleep at a wheel. We've got Keir Starmer seeking US approval of using our own weapons because of gyroscopes or whatever we have in our own weapons to be able to use them. Any agreement is a fallacy. Ultimately, Putin won't accept even his current gains on a current agreement for a medium term, because I don't think he can sell even the losses that he's had just to get what he's got so far. And Ukraine can't accept anything, right? They've accepted agreements in the past. They've accepted security pacts. They've gone through ceasefires. They've tried almost everything. They've given up their nukes, a large number of munitions. They've given up everything. We've got to the point, surely, where there are very few options on the table. The outlook looks relatively bleak. So I'm curious what you guys think happens next.
Did you get out the bed the wrong side this morning, James? You're leading us all to be very depressed.
I'm sorry, and I've honestly, I watch and I read about it every day. It's been pretty much an obsession. Okay. And I think, go on, sorry.
Right, let's hear what Peter thinks about what next in this war. What happens next, Peter?
Well, so much hinges on the American election. I wish it didn't, frankly, but it does. If Trump wins the election, then the out. I mean, frankly, I mean, I sympathise with the caller, or I agree to a degree. It does look pretty bleak these days. But if Trump wins, it'll look a lot bleaker. That's for sure. But to put on, to take the other side, look at the other side of the coin. If Trump loses. I think he's then out of politics, and I think all the majority of the Republican Party in America, which is sympathetic to Ukraine, would all things being equal, be prepared to support Ukraine. Then comes on side, and then we have a much stronger bipartisan American position. So actually, the situation, if Kamala Harris wins, could look a lot more promising. But fundamentally, we need to see. Russia respects strength and strength alone. It doesn't care about Russia. Putin doesn't believe in win-win. He doesn't believe in the concept of it. He believes in strength. And if the West shows real strength, if they lift all restrictions, if they increase armaments to Ukraine, if they begin getting serious about producing weapons themselves, I think that then we've got a chance of getting somewhere towards ending the war on favourable terms. But it good until we've got, as I already played, security guarantees in place.
Okay, Peter, your screen froze there a bit, but we got your drift. Simon, briefly, because we need to go to the news in a second.
Well, I'm very conscious.
What happens next?
James sets out a perfectly respectable scenario, a very depressing one. I think we've got to continue to show solidarity. I think, UK should be leading, dare I say, on the defence spending debate. We've got to incentivise America, who are the biggest contributors, and this is in the widest sense over NATO as well. We're going to incentivise the American population to continue to stay in this and recognise this as a shared endeavour. We can't afford virtue signalling, as our Foreign Secretary did over arms sales to Israel, for instance. That just doesn't play well. The Germans have got to step up. And in many ways, although, as I say, I'd naturally be a small C Conservative Republican supporter, I really do worry that Trump has really unsettled the allies of Britain. And we shouldn't just think that we're going to impose anything on the Ukrainians. They will continue to fight. And Churchill always said, nations that go down fighting rise again. Those that surrender disappear. Ukraine has had a pretty bloody history over many centuries. They've got strong, memories, as of course the Russians do, and they will not just lay down their weapons. So, in some ways, we've really got to find all sorts of reasons why we should continue to keep Ukraine in the fight. They're doing a lot of the fighting for us, and the least we can do is give them the wherewithal to do so.
Right, well, we will hear more from Peter, more from Simon in just a few moments, and more from you, 0345 6060 973. Michael in Dublin, thank you for your message. He says, well done, Iain, you've handled some very difficult topics tonight. It's my job, Michael. It's what I do. I quite like difficult. Mind you, stay tuned after 9, because should we say we're going to have a bit of a lighter topic after 9? And it's basically why Generation Z or members of Generation Z, why don't they enjoy themselves? They don't drink, they don't do drugs, they don't have sex. What do they do as teenagers? I mean, it wasn't like that in my day, I'll tell you. I won't ask Simon or Peter what it was like for them. It's 8:33 on LBC News Headlines with Darryl Jackson.
The Israeli Prime Minister says reports about a possible ceasefire between his country and Hezbollah are not true, and he's instructed his military to keep fighting. Benjamin Netanyahu claims a top Air Force commander from the Iran-backed group has been killed today. A number of potential new victims of Mohammed al-Fayed have contacted the Metropolitan Police. The former Harrods boss is being investigated over allegations of historic sexual assault and rape. And a man's been arrested after train passengers at some of the country's biggest rail stations were hit by a cybersecurity incident which saw them exposed to Islamophobic messages. Manchester Piccadilly, Birmingham New Street and 11 stations in London were affected yesterday. LBC weather turning very wet this evening for most of England and Wales. A few showers for Northern Ireland and Scotland with a low of 3 degrees.
This is LBC. This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
I should have said before, we are streaming this on Global Player. If you'd like to watch this hour of the programme, we have Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall with us, former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, and also Peter Dickinson, editor of the Atlantic Council's UkraineAlert blog. He's speaking to us live from Kyiv. I want to talk a little bit about your book, Simon, in just a moment, but just following on from our discussion before the news, do you worry for the future of NATO if Donald Trump becomes president? Because, he's rumoured not to be a fan of NATO, and yet I can't really. He doesn't have the power to withdraw America from NATO, but he can make it quite difficult, can't he?
Oh, extremely difficult, and it is that leadership role. There was a natural deferral to the Americans. This is why I find slightly bizarre the European attempt to form some separate organisation, to actively encourage the Americans to withdraw, given that we know it's a lot of just political grandstanding with no what's the word I'm saying, desire to spend the money required to remotely replace the American contribution. So the North Atlantic bit of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, absolutely critical, including the Canadians, of course. And Donald Trump's quite right, as Barack Obama was, as I suspect Biden was, to hold our feet to the fire about our contribution. To say you cannot expect, particularly when you've got a threat on your border now, a very, very clear and present danger with Putin, that you can continue to use American taxpayers' dollars, frankly, to give yourself a lifestyle that you patently can't afford because you're not growing. And so we need a narrative in Europe. It's not helped by the French ambitions, often, to be a European leader. It's not helped, of course, by German reticence to pay their fair share. So Britain has a really important role to straddle the Atlantic, and I'm less convinced by the current Labour government has the wherewithal or the commitment to fulfil that role, because it really has been extraordinarily important over the many years of NATO's existence.
Now, your book has the intriguing title, The House of War, the struggle between Christendom and the Caliphate. Explain, obviously that's just the title, but what's the thesis of the book?
Well, the title of the book, House of War, is an Arabic expression, Islamic expression, the Dar al-Harb. Lands under Muslim domination, the Dar al-Salam, they're the lands of peace, less so perhaps today. But from the first time the Islamic armies, very shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, came up against Byzantium in an extraordinary 100-year period. The Rashidun, the Umayyads, and then the Abbasid caliphates, the Arab leadership of the Muslim world, Sunni Muslim world, absolutely destroyed the Persian Empire, took the Levant, took Mesopotamia, took the Holy Land, took all of North Africa, all the way through Spain, and was only defeated, really, or pushed back at Tours. And I've really just tracked basically 1,300 years of confrontation, because the caliphate is abolished by Turkey, by Ataturk in 1924, 1,300 years, and looked at it through the prism of 10 great sieges and battles. And they'll be known to many of your listeners and viewers. In there, Jerusalem, the Battle of the Horns of Hattin with Saladin, the expulsion of the Crusader kingdom by the Mamluks, the fall of Constantinople, Istanbul, well known to people, the great battles of Malta, of Rhodes and Malta with the Knights of St. John against the Ottomans, Lepanto, the great sea battle, Don John of Austria, and ultimately the high water mark of the Ottoman advance outside Vienna in 1683. Funnily enough, which was taken as the inspiration for Tolkien's Battle for Minas Tirith. And it really just tracks the idea of the Caliphate and Christendom as organising principles for these religious, military, ideological blocks. And it's designed to be interesting, designed to be educative, and it's what I call applied history, that if you look at the sort of language that Osama bin Laden used, or Islamic State, it mines history, and it's a bit like Putin to an extent, very selective about the use of historical reference points in a manner that, of course, goes back to perhaps our earlier conversation we're less confident to do in the West because we don't teach our own history with any degree of pride or any degree of a positive nature at the moment. And that makes us quite vulnerable to very strong narratives from people who in opposition. But I think much of this is relevant to today, to understanding Turkey, Iran, where ISIS comes from, Muslim Brotherhood, why the Gulf states, feel the way they do about their own entitlement, inspiration, and grievance.
I think there's a real thirst among people now to learn much more about what I would call sort of ancient history. We know a lot about 20th century history, but how many of us can really trace the origins of a lot of the current disputes that are taking place in and around the Mediterranean?
Can I commend my book to your
Well, indeed.
Can you commend my book
I'll
to your
give the title again, The House of War, the struggle between Christendom and the Caliphate. And it's been published in the last 10 days. So you should be able to get copies of it very easily from all good and bad bookshops. I always say that. Peter Dickinson, can you recommend a relatively concise history of Ukraine that people couldn't get hold of? Because I think most people listening to this programme, and I include myself in this, I knew a little bit about Ukraine, but not very much before the war. Now, we know an awful lot more now. But for instance, I didn't know that Kiev existed way before Moscow ever did. So the whole history of the last 1,000 years of Ukraine would be great to read about. Can you recommend anything?
Yeah, well, I think the books by Sergei Plokhy, Plokhy. He's the head of the Harvard University Ukrainian Studies Institute. He's published a number of books that are kind of considered like the definitive versions of Ukrainian history. But Ukrainians themselves, to a significant degree, are still discovering their own history. It was suppressed for a long time.
Yeah.
For a long time. I arrived in Ukraine in the late 1990s, and then it was literally people did not know a lot of their own history. I often meet people even now who are surprised by various aspects of Ukraine's past, because it was always taught through a Russian prism, through an imperial context. And it's only now, people are just getting to the idea that they've got to start looking at Ukrainian history, detaching it from all these imperial narratives that were always the case.
Simon?
Well, it's funnily enough, because, and I'm sure Peter knows this, the area of the Donbass was originally really owned by the Khanate of Crimea. It's a hangover from the Mongol hordes, and was allied with the Ottoman Empire. And this is where, as I say, Putin very cleverly mines history, because it was Russia that to an extent liberated or took over the area of the Donbass that we're talking about from the Ottomans, and then pushed on into southeastern Europe. And the western part of Ukraine, in the Dnieper, west of the Dnieper, was part of the, can you believe it, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And hence, to an extent, you have two quite different cultures. But as we say, if you wanted to say that that was an excuse to start invading another country, then every border in the world is frankly open to the same sort of selective mining of history in order to justify appallingly aggressive behaviour.
Right, let's go to another call. James is in Barnes. Hello, James.
Hi, good evening. I'm interested that one of your panel, who's a soldier, general, that Lord Dannatt, who I'm sure that the gentleman is aware of, who was on LBC frequently prior to the Ukraine war, when Putin was amassing his troops on the border. And as we know, Yeltsin and Gorbachev were very concerned about Ukraine ever being granted NATO membership. And Lord Dannatt said many, many times on this radio station, he is sure that behind the scenes, the West, the presidents of America, the Prime Minister of England, are all reassuring Mr. President Putin that NATO will never allow Ukraine to become a member of of NATO. And I wondered whether they talk about that this is his imperialist Russia, this is his what he really wants. That maybe that is there not a point that it is the membership of NATO that was the reason he invaded Ukraine, and not his going back to Russia's imperial past, as if there's some analogy with Hitler, that it's Poland next. And
there's a flaw in that argument, James, isn't there? Because he invaded Crimea way before.
Sure, I know he did. Yeah.
Yeah, but that was before the NATO thing really took hold, wasn't it?
Although, and I'm not an apologist for him, because he's an appalling man. But Crimea, as we all know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, was part of Russia, and I think that President Trump, again, as much as I do not like the man, I think he would end this war in a minute, because I think the end game here do the West think that Ukraine can beat Russia? No, it's impossible. So what is we're right to not let Russia overtake Ukraine, 100%. But surely there comes a time that the West has to say, well, we're never going to defeat Russia, so therefore we have to stop them taking Ukraine. But do we not have to get everybody around the table and say, what are we going to do to stop this war, rather than, this nonsense of supplying Ukraine?
As I would say, that is Zelensky's decision, not ours.
Yeah, interesting you say that, Jake. There was a statement once, and Peter may or may not agree, that Russia with Ukraine is like America. I think you'd overstate it. Russia without Ukraine is like Canada. Be under no illusions, the sheer mineral resource wealth of Ukraine. One of the reasons we went to war, and I was part of the coalition force in Kuwait, was we did not wish Saddam Hussein to get his hands on the oil wealth of the Gulf. If Putin does get his hands on the oil, grain, phosphate, mineral wealth of Ukraine and harnesses it to his own war machine, which is now on a genuine national war footing, you are left with a really deeply worrying problem of Russia with the capacity to continue its expansionist thing. This is not just about land. It's the reason that Hitler diverted Guderian and his troops in 1941, just when they were on the brink of taking Moscow, to go down to Kyiv to seize the Donbass, because it is absolutely the breadbasket of that area, let alone everything else that comes out in terms of energy. So it is not just a bit of ground or an aggression. It is the capacity for Ukraine to be harnessed to the Russian war machine in the long term. And, of course, begin to redress the balance, which has been severely tipped in Beijing's favour between Moscow and Beijing, because Putin is fundamentally a client state or a client of Xi Jinping in China as a result of the losses he's suffered in this war.
James, I have a question for you from a listener who's just texted in. You've just taken a call from James in Barnes. I think I was at the same school as him, Aldwickbury in Harpenden in Hertfordshire. Can you confirm this, James? Pardon?
I was at Mill Hill School.
Ah, well, I was trying to play Friends Reunited, but it didn't really work, did it?
Ian, I must say, Ian, can I just say one thing? Although we come from the different spectrums of the political spectrum, you are a fantastic broadcaster and a credit to LBC, really. And you have a great sense of humour, seriously. The only shame is you support West Ham.
Well, there we go. We all have our crosses to bear, don't we?
Right.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I've lost the text here, but there was a question for you, Simon, saying, is your book available as an audiobook?
It is. Narrated by myself.
Well, I should hope so too.
Hugely, it was almost more demanding.
I hate recording audiobooks
than writing it. My brain was addled. My tongue was about 3 times its normal size, and every word with an S in it, I ended up lisping.
And there are so many words that you think, well, how do I pronounce that? Particularly in books like this, I imagine. Right, what's the time? Have we done a break yet? We haven't. Right, we'd better do a break because it's 10 to 9.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:52 on LBC. Right, let's go to Rani in Cardiff. Hello, Rani.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for your continued support for Ukraine and keeping the issue alive. I have friends and family in Eastern Europe, and I have traveled there before the wall fell when it was still communist, and I know you cannot trust Putin. And I'd like to ask the panel, since he is such a liar and murders even his own people, he wants probably a deal that Ukraine will not join NATO. And if that's on the table and it's agreed, how can Ukraine trust him? Because he'll just come and invade. As soon as that's a deal, he'll come right back and invade Ukraine again, just like with the nuclear program. He got them to agree to drop it, and he invaded. So, I mean, does your panel see this being on the table, and what do they think would happen?
Peter Dickinson.
Yeah, well, I think the NATO issue is key. And I think it's important to clarify when we talk about Putin's objections to Ukrainian NATO membership, what we actually mean here, because there seems to be, and your earlier caller alluded to this, not this current caller, I think it was James a few minutes ago, that was, the reason they invaded was because Russia somehow felt threatened by NATO. Now, we've seen since the invasion began that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, and Putin said, I don't care, although that doubled Russia's border with NATO. So Russia's objections to NATO enlargement, so to speak, are not connected with Russian security. They're connected with Russia's ability to dominate its neighbours, in particular Ukraine. So Russia doesn't have a problem with NATO per se. Russia has a problem with Ukraine and Ukraine independence. So Ukraine has a major issue there that it has to address, and by definition, that the international community does too. Ukraine has to have credible security guarantees, or this will go on. We're going to see it again, 3 or 4 years down the line, and that's very well understood, I think, in Ukraine. NATO membership is very challenging to achieve, as we discussed. Security guarantees on a bilateral level are difficult because who's going to agree to that? Who's going to commit to a potential war with Russia? So the third option really is massively increasing Ukraine's own domestic military strength. It's a poor option really, but it looks like the more realistic of those that are on the table in terms of boosting Ukraine's domestic armaments industry and getting Ukraine into a position with Western support and Western armaments where it can be much stronger against, future potential Russian attacks. But realistically, if they don't get those security guarantees, it's going to be challenging.
Before I come to you, Simon, just want to briefly cross to Washington, where Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Kamala Harris are holding a press conference.
Today we have a new strong support package, as you said, and we have common view on the things that need to be done. We have to keep pressure on Russia to stop the war and to make truly lasting and just peace. It's a top priority for us and for other freedom-loving nations to achieve not a freezing, but real peace for us. So we need to keep sanctions against Russia strong, and we need to use the proceeds from immobilized Russian assets to protect Ukraine, our people, our cities, our front line from Russian evil. And of course, we must work hard to bring all Russian war criminals to justice. And one more thing, I want to inform Madam Vice President about the latest Russian missile and Shahid's attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. We need to urgently strengthen Ukraine's air defense to save thousands of lives and reduce Russian terror to zero. It's achievable. Thank you again. Thanks, America. Thanks to you, Madam Vice President. Slava Ukraine.
Well, that's a nice little handshake at the end there. He was talking up a bipartisan approach to Ukraine, interestingly as well, I'm told. So Simon Mayall, let's come back to you on the question from Rani. Would Putin uphold any peace deal?
No, I fear we're now dealing with a Russian leader who really cannot be trusted to be brought back into what we might call the community of nations. I think in my lifetime it's one of the biggest strategic tragedies that we were unable to lock Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union into being a really responsible member of the international community.
Did we try hard enough?
I don't think we did try hard enough. I think we treated Russia with a disdain, and we really need to acknowledge, and again, I bow to nobody, there is no excuse for what has happened in Russia. It doesn't matter what your historical delving will dig up about your right to invade another country. But the reality is we gave Putin the sort of firepower to build a narrative allied to a strong sense of Russian identity, nationalism, suffering. And the Russian people have a capacity for enormous suffering. I'm not saying the Ukrainians don't as well. But we've made it into this huge challenge to the international rules-based world order, and we must prevail in this. It's a great pity we had to reach this stage, but we did not take the consequences, the huge consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, to try and embrace Russia, and we're paying the consequences, and we're just going to have to hold the line now and come out the far side victorious on this one.
Apologies to those of you that I couldn't get on. Malcolm, you were up next in Bodmin, but we've run out of time. We could go on for another hour, but I think probably after 2 hours on various wars on the programme, we're all a bit worn out. Peter Dickinson from the UkraineAlert blog, thank you for joining us live from Kyiv. And Sir Simon Mayall's book is called The House of War, The Struggle Between Christendom and the Caliphate. Somebody's asking, how do you spell Mayall? Mayall. And you can find it wherever you buy your books. Thank you very much indeed. Coming up in the next hour, Britain is falling out of love with booze, according to new research, as young adults drive a national trend towards cutting down on alcohol. 1 in 4 members of Generation Z, those aged 18 to 24, is completely teetotal. Not at LBC, they're not. With rates of sobriety in the age group twice as high as in their parents' generation. And when you take into account that teenage pregnancy rates are at an all-time low, that drug taking among that generation is also low, when apparently this generation love eating kale and avocados, what on earth do you do for fun? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Israel's military